Hello everyone. Hello everyone, welcome to my first dev diary, the first in a series in which I will be documenting my progress, developing a VR game with Unity for the Oculus Rift. Now, straight off the bat, is this series for you? Well, if you're looking for a more amateur perspective on video game development, then hopefully yes. I often find that a lot of the dev diaries you seem to find on YouTube are kind of intimidating. Within just a few episodes, they'll make some crazy looking game that just seems so far beyond my own abilities. So we're going for a pretty in-depth series. I'm going to be talking you through as much of my process as I can, what design decisions I'm making, the kind of mistakes and pitfalls that I run into, the issues I face. And yeah, I'm going to be assuming that you have some general experience and knowledge with game development, Unity. I'm going to be using C#. I'm probably not going to be going through that much actual code. It's going to be more about just kind of process and decisions and that kind of thing. Who is this series not for? Well, if you're looking for any kind of expert advice or guidance, you're definitely not going to find it here. Have I ever worked in game dev? No. Have I ever published any kind of games outside of, 24-hour game jams? No. Am I some kind of game dev expert? Absolutely not. Wow, this really isn't how you sell a new series. The truth is, I'm probably going to be making a fair few mistakes as I go along, but the benefit of this whole thing is that we will have those nicely documented, we can see exactly what went wrong, and yeah, hopefully we can learn from those. We're going to start off in this episode by talking about what the game is actually going to be, how we're going to go about developing it, what our main requirements are going to be. In a few episodes' time, we'll move on to the design, hashing out what the general architecture will look like, how it all fits together. Maybe episode 4 or 5 will actually get started in Unity. So, what will I be making? Well, as I said before, it will be a virtual reality game, but it's not really a game. Yeah, it has game logic and animation and models and sound effects and a scoring system and a leveling difficulty system and all the things that would normally make a game, but it's not a game. Or at least that's not what you're going to be there for. We will be making a virtual reality exposure therapy system / game. What on earth is that? Well, exposure therapy is a therapy that exposes you to a version of a stimulus you're afraid of, say spiders, in the hope of desensitizing you to your fear of that particular thing and basically treating your phobia. So there are a few different variations on this, but we're going to be mainly looking at what's called graded exposure. This works by basically tackling your phobia in levels. For example, level 1 might be looking at a picture of a spider. The next level might be having that spider in a box on the other side of the room, and then one of the hardest levels might be holding that spider in your hand. Now, as a treatment, this does work pretty well, but it has got a fair few limitations. You actually have to go and get an appointment with a therapist, and you have to have some version of your phobia on hand, which is inconvenient but doable if it's, say, a spider. But what if you want to treat, say, a fear of flying? You can't just hop on an airplane, have a look around, and then get back off again. This is where VR comes in. You can have any stimulus you want without needing to go and get an appointment, spend money on a therapist, leave the house, and the entire time, if it gets too much, you can just slip off the headset and then you're back in your kitchen or living room or bedroom or wherever you are in the real world. Now, a VR exposure therapy system like this isn't a brand new idea. There are already apps on the Oculus Store that do this, but we're going to be trying to do it better. One of the key things we'll be adding is a scoring system, so we're going to be gamifying the treatment, awarding the player points based on how well they engage with their stimulus and basically just how brave they are. I'm also hoping to get a whole variety of different stimuluses built in for different phobias. So, spiders, wasps, heights, fear of flying, public speaking. But for now, we'll just be sticking with spiders. Now, I find one of the hardest parts of a project like this is just getting started. You want to have a fairly solid design down before you start. Because if you don't think about how everything's going to fit together, you just end up developing yourself into a hole where the architecture's a mess and it's really hard to track down bugs and add new features, and you just make it just difficult for yourself. But then on the flip side, it's very easy just to think about it forever and not actually start writing any code at any point. There's also just a lot of considerations that you're just not going to foresee until you actually start doing it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take an iterative prototype approach where we take a tiny version of what we're going to achieve, see how that plays out, see what works, see what doesn't work, iterate on that with a larger prototype, more depth, more complexity, more features. Evaluate that, see what the little quirks of the architecture there are, the things that are causing us issues that we didn't think about before. And then when we get started on the actual thing, we can have a pretty solidly designed foundation so that we don't run into a situation 100 hours down the line where we think, wow, it would have been so much easier if we just did it this different way from the very start. Now, plot twist, I already actually have the first 2 prototypes done and finished. That was actually my dissertation while I was getting my degree from the University of University of Sheffield. So we're skipping straight to evaluating the prototypes and building our foundations. We are going to be making a brand new Unity project, but we are probably going to be copying over some code that is probably transferable from the prototypes, maybe some assets and some scene data as well. Okay, so this is prototype number 1, super mini lightweight prototype. This is the virtual environment we're working with. Pretty basic, it's not a whole lot to it. A little outside area just to give it sort of nice vibe. The first problem we can see before even starting to tackle any of the phobias is on the table in front of us here. Press space to toggle spider. Change size with the up and down arrows. Yo, where's my keyboard? Don't ask the player for keyboard input while they're wearing the headset on their face because you can't see anything. And it means that you have to like sort of slip it up a bit and like give your keyboard a little side eye, and it just breaks immersion. You're sort of meant to feel like you're actually in the environment. And yeah, having to sort of blindly feel for your keyboard buttons isn't only just really unintuitive, but it also kind of ruins the experience a bit as well. So don't. So one thing I tried on this prototype was actually having multiple phobias in the same Unity scene. The idea of this was to save development time and only having one scene that you can just reuse over and over again. The issue is something like fear of heights. It's kind of hard to tackle a fear of heights in a sensible way in an enclosed room. So this is what we ended up coming up with. Oh yeah, this will really help my anxiety when the floor is sinking away beneath my feet. Man, it's going to be so cool, and we can have our entire bodies in VR, and you can like see your legs swinging off the edge of this chair. Woohoo! We have a pretty similar problem with the claustrophobia mode. So again, kind of surreal. Everything sort of sinks into the floor, and then the walls literally move in towards you, and we get some lovely clipping with that big wooden window panel, and I think with this lamp as well. Not just, but yeah, a little bit strange. I also think that it's possible that a big component of this particular phobia is more the physical than just the visual. So I'm not particularly sure how well this one will actually work in VR in the first place. So the main takeaways from that first prototype, having multiple phobias in the same scene in Unity doesn't work so well. It really restricts what you can do, and it makes anything that you can do kind of surreal. Doesn't really make sense to have the environment where you're facing a spider be the same as the environment where you're facing heights. Having the UI on the screen in front of you works pretty well. It's fairly clear, but there isn't a lot of space on that TV to actually fit many UI elements in the first place. So bigger TV, more UI elements. Having some tooltip UI on the table in front of you is okay, but when you have the spider walking around the table, or the table sinks 50 foot beneath the ground, you can't really read that very well. Let's not forget the main problem of maybe don't have the player needing to find their keyboard keys while they are wearing a brick over their face. Top tip number 1, don't check out to a different Git branch while your project is in play mode. It makes Unity take a massive shit. So here we have our second prototype. This time you start in a sort of level selection area, so each stimulus will be a different scene. You can choose which level you want to start at. Each one has your high score next to it. Again, we just have spiders in this prototype. It's pretty much the same scene as before. I've enhanced the lighting a bit so it's a bit less dingy. Put some artwork around the walls, make it feel a bit more lived in, make it a bit more comfortable for the user. I've made that TV at the front a lot bigger, more UI elements. There is a voiceover. I was originally going to use my own voice, but I just didn't have a good enough quality mic at the time. So I used AWS Poly, which is a speech synthesis service.
Hello, and welcome to the Virtual Reality Exposure Therapy System. During this introductory voiceover, take the time to look around you and familiarize yourself with the environment.
Yeah, it basically goes on like that. I think for the actual thing, I'm just going to use my own voice because it sounds a little bit robotic, and some people may find that a little bit unsettling, which is not exactly what we're going for in a therapy app. Okay, so this is pretty much how the treatment goes. This is level 1. Each level you have a voiceover and some kind of version of the stimulus on the table in front of you. Now, this one's just a laptop with a picture of a spider. The voiceover is just talking about some basic spider facts, and then there's questions on those on the TV. And that is basically the scoring system for this particular level. A later level here is just having a spider in a glass box on the table, and the game mechanic is just to sort of get close to the box, and we're doing some checks in the code for basically how close the camera is to the spider, and then awarding a score based off of that. What you saw just there is the subjective units of distress. So this is basically how anxious the player felt during that level. The idea is to collect those at the end of each level and then use that to basically chart the player's progress. We're going to have a big graph somewhere that will then show their responses for each level. And then hopefully, if they repeat use of the system enough times, then they will start to see their anxiety responses come down. And that will then prove to the player that they're actually getting somewhere with their treatment. So this is level 5, maybe 5 or 6. And the spider is just walking out some shapes on the table. And you have to basically answer what shape the spider is walking. Again, it's a little bit jank. We've got definitely a higher quality spider model that we're using. But the movement could be a bit better. How this is actually working in the code is we have a bunch of invisible blocks, and the spider is basically getting the coordinates of each of those blocks in the path and then moving towards that block. And that's why it's a bit jank. This one here, you just have a randomly moving spider, so it's just getting a random coordinate just anywhere on the table and moving towards that with a sort of different speed every time, which looks a bit better. The only game mechanic here is to use the grip buttons on the controllers, so no keyboard anymore, just the Oculus controllers, the touch controllers. And yeah, if you make the spider its maximum size, then you get maximum points, and that's pretty much all there is to that scoring system. And the final and most difficult level in this prototype is just having a bunch of spiders on the table. And the only game mechanic in this one is just to basically sit and wait for the timer to run out. And if you reach the end of the 2 minutes, you score 100. So what worked well with that second prototype? Well, the UI was certainly nicer, and being able to navigate with the Oculus touch controllers rather than the keyboard is definitely a lot more convenient. The environment was definitely a bit more improved, better lighting, looked a bit more comfortable, and having that leveling system where you can see all the high scores and just jump in at any level is definitely an improvement as well. Having the voiceover for each level works pretty well, especially for the first level though, it drags on quite a bit. I've linked the entire demonstration for that prototype below, so if you watch that you'll see what I mean. It just goes on for a bit too long. You can skip the entire level, but it would be good maybe just to skip individual sentences of dialogue rather than the entire level. The main issue is that the game mechanics just aren't all that interesting. When I tested them with users, it did make people engage with the treatment more than if they weren't there, but answering comprehension questions and waiting for the timer to run down just isn't particularly fun and doesn't really give the player any reason to keep coming back for more. And it's kind of a system that only really works with repeated use. That's how your anxiety response comes down. So we're using the Oculus touch controllers for the UI right now, but we're not really using any of the motion tracking capabilities. And if we were to do that, we then open up a whole new array of possibilities. We can have the player actually touching the spiders, playing with them, interacting much more directly by just having hands in the environment. So that is definitely something we should be looking at for the final thing. Something else that should become easier once we have motion tracking implemented is the code behind the UI. In that prototype, we just have UI navigation just with buttons. And that means that we have to keep track of the X and Y position of the UI element currently selected, as well as the maximum number of UI elements in each direction so that we don't go out of bounds of the array. That number is changing all the time because the number of UI elements in each level is always changing. Some levels have the comprehension questions where there's a set number of elements on the screen. We have that subjective unit of distress, a 1 to 10 input keep coming up. And just for whatever levels we want to come up with in the future, may very well have just an awkward number of UI buttons. So we have to keep track of in the code, and it's a pain. Once we have the motion tracking implemented, we can just give the user a hand to point to whatever UI element they want to activate. And I have a feeling that will make the code much simpler. We'll be looking at that next episode. Honestly, just the entire architecture behind the UI control was just a bit of a mess in that prototype. So we can look at that and hopefully learn from the mistakes we made there. And then, hopefully have an improved design for this project. We'll be looking at that in a few episodes' time. Okay, so to wrap up, I'm just going to go through our main functional requirements just to get those down. I'm not going to go into all the detail here, just the main big ticket stuff. So I have an Oculus Rift consumer version 1, so we're going to be developing the game for that particular platform. I did get some time to port the prototype over to a Rift S, and that worked straight away without even really having to change anything. Port to the HTC Vive was also pretty straightforward. Had to change a few little bits here and there, mainly to do with the camera position, but that was pretty much fine. So if we decide to also hit those platforms later on, then that shouldn't be too much of an issue. We want support for the Oculus Touch controllers, and we want a user interface that functions by pointing at the element you want to activate. We want to keep the level selection area that shows you each different mode for different phobias, all the levels that you've unlocked, and the high score that you have achieved for that particular level. We want to have a variety of different phobias. We're just going to start with spiders for now, but we want to sort of keep it in our minds that we want to be able to have it expandable like that. And we want each phobia to consist of incrementally increasing levels of difficulty. Each one should have an interesting scoring system, not just waiting for a timer to run down. And each level should be accompanied by some kind of voiceover that explains what to do and guides the user through the game. We also want to have that subjective units of distress 1 to 10 input after each level. And we want to also be saving that along with the scores in some kind of file somewhere, so we've got some kind of persistence between uses of the system. And we want to have somewhere where we kind of graph all that data out so the user can track their progress. That's pretty much it for today. As you can see, the production quality of this entire setup isn't particularly premium. You guys are going to be seeing a whole lot of my kitchen. I might spruce things up a bit eventually, maybe get some logos or some intros or some outros going, work on my lighting a bit. I'm pretty much at the mercy of whatever the weather decides to do right now. Right now, this series is mainly just for me. It just helps to kind of verbalize your thought process during development and honestly just keep track of what you're doing. If you're anything like me, then you'll come to the situation where you take a break from programming for a short time, and then you come back to it and look at your code and look at, some code that you've written or a design decision that you've made and just be like, why the f*** have I done it like that? So hopefully it will help me have some sort of documented process, and hopefully it will help some of you guys out there too. That's it for today. I will catch you guys in the next one.